Snowstorms had a way of swallowing sound on the frontier. Even a bustling winter morning in the old American town felt muted under the thick white blanket that covered the ground and rooftops. Folks moved carefully along the wooden sidewalks, boots crunching, breaths turning to smoke in the air. Wagons rolled slow, pulled by horses whose flanks steamed from the cold. Every man, woman, and child kept their eyes ahead, as if pretending not to notice the silent figure slumped on the edge of the main road. A wounded Comanche warrior lay in the snow. His horse had collapsed. Beside him, sides heaving, nostrils flaring with frost, the warrior's clothing was torn, dark patches of dried blood showing against the tan leather. His feathered headdress was tilted to one side, and his gloved hand pressed against his ribs as if holding himself together. He breathed with effort, each breath thin and ragged. And even though he said nothing, his presence alone was enough to freeze the town in place. No one dared to step close. People whispered from a distance. Some stood together near the mercantile, others near the blacksmith's forge, all pretending to mind their business while their eyes stayed locked on him. The tension hung heavy in the cold air. Stories about raids, past conflicts, and old fears spread fast in small towns. And fear was an easy thing to feed when winter made a person feel fragile, but the warrior didn't feel threatening. If anything, his stillness looked like surrender. Like someone who had been running for too long and finally collapsed where the road widened. No one in town wanted trouble, yet no one wanted to help either. A saddlebag lay partly open at his side. Beside it, a small wooden carving rested in the snow, shaped like a bird lifting its wings. Folks noticed it, whispered about it, wondered what it meant. Some said the carving was a sign of peace. Others said it marked him as someone dangerous. No one was brave enough to find out the truth. Across the road, standing outside the dry goods store, was a woman wrapped in a long wool coat. Wind tugged at the loose strands of her dark hair as her eyes studied the wounded stranger. She was a widow, known in town for keeping to herself, raising her boy alone, and running her small cabin with quiet strength. Life had hardened her softly, leaving her with a calm, steady way of moving, as if she had learned long ago how to survive hurt without showing it. She held a sack of flour in one arm, but her focus wasn't on her errands anymore. It was on the warrior in the snow. Something tugged at her, memory, something she couldn't name yet. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A few men stepped forward, hands resting near their belts, more out of habit than intention. The sheriff wasn't in sight. He had ridden out earlier that morning to check the northern pasture, leaving the town unsettled. Folks didn't know whether they should chase the Comanche away, help him, or simply wait for him to die. The widow didn't speak to anyone. Instead, she watched the warrior's chest rise and fall with growing difficulty. He was close to losing consciousness. His fingers shook where they pressed against his wound. Snowflakes landed on his shoulders, melting slowly from the heat still left in him. Then the wind shifted, brushing a few strands of her hair across her cheek, and with it came a faint memory, a scent of pine, the sting of winter, the sound of a horse fighting against a storm. The image hit her so suddenly she nearly dropped the flour sack. She blinked hard, trying to clear her mind. Years ago, long before she moved into her cabin near the river, she had been caught in a terrible blizzard, the kind that swallowed the sky and erased the land. She had been younger then, frightened, cold beyond sense, her horse stumbling in the whiteout. She remembered falling, the snow swallowing her whole, and then she remembered arms lifting her from the ground. Strong arms, a voice speaking softly in a language she didn't understand, a figure carrying her through the storm when she was too weak to walk, but the details blurred, as if hidden behind fog. All she remembered clearly was warmth, safety, the feeling of being carried by someone who should have been her enemy, yet treated her as though her life mattered. Her heart paced quicker. She stared at the wounded warrior again. Her breath caught, the shape of his face, the quiet strength in his posture, the same bird carving she now recognized, the one she had noticed in her memory, tucked near his belt on that long-ago night. It wasn't proof, not fully. Something deep in her spirit whispered truth. This might be the same man, the warrior who had saved her life once. But the townsfolk didn't know any of that. To them, he was a threat lying in the snow, a danger waiting to wake, a reminder of battles and grief. No one wanted to take the first step toward him, not even to check if he was still alive. The widow's fingers tightened around the flour sack until her knuckles turned pale. She knew what would happen if no one helped him. The cold alone would finish him within the hour. Or worse, someone nervous and jumpy might make a mistake, forcing a tragedy that didn't need to happen. Her heart ached at the thought of that. She had known loss, too much of it, enough to understand what fear did to good people. But she also knew what it meant to owe a life debt. Snow drifted across the road, covering the warrior's leg halfway. He didn't move. His eyes were half open, distant, unfocused. He was drifting somewhere far away. Someone in the crowd shouted that he should be dragged outside of town. Another said he must have come to scout or spy. Others argued that he might be running from something worse. Maybe another group trailing him. Their voices grew harsh and uneasy. The widow took a slow breath. Old American towns carried rules that were never written, codes built on survival and pride. Helping an outsider, especially a wounded Comanche, was not a choice folks made lightly. But letting a man die in the snow, when he wasn't lifting a hand in harm, felt like a wrong she couldn't ignore. Her heart pushed her toward him, even while her mind warned her. About the anger it might stir, she set the flour sack down on the step behind her. Then, with boots sinking into the snow, she walked forward. The murmurs silenced instantly. Every eye in town followed her, disbelief freezing them in place. Some called her back. Others warned her not to be foolish. But she kept moving, each step steady, each breath controlled. The warrior didn't notice her at first. Only when her shadow fell across him did his eyes shift slightly. She knelt beside him, up close. She could see the pain in his features, the cold biting into him, the blood seeping slowly from his side. His wound wasn't fresh, which meant he had traveled far despite the pain. The carving beside him rested near her knee. The same bird with wings lifting upward. The memory pressed deeper into her mind. She touched the edge of his coat gently. His eyes opened a little wider. Not in fear, not in anger, but in recognition. The world around them seemed to disappear. The whispers, the cold, the watchful crowd all faded. She felt the connection in her chest like a spark. The memory from the blizzard grew clearer, his face lifting her from the snow. Carrying her when no one else could, she swallowed hard, breath-catching. Behind her, the crowd began to shift nervously, waiting to see what she would do next, or whether danger would rise between them and this wounded stranger. But she wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She was thinking about the night she nearly died. She was thinking about the one pair of arms that had saved her, and now, in the middle of the snowy road, she whispered the only words she could find as the warrior's eyes held hers with faint recognition of their own. Then something moved behind the crowd, and a shadow stepped onto the road, tightening the air and bringing a new kind of tension none of them were prepared for. You said, "Continue from where the introduction left off and write the next." 1,200 words for my story. This part should provide background and context, helping to deepen the plot and characters. Keep building suspense, but don't resolve any of the tension created in the previous section. Expand on the mystery or conflict, and keep the narrative engaging with additional relevant keywords. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also, make the script human-centric, and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. AI sees the ellipsis as 3 dots. So it reads it as ... That's why do not use 3 or 2 dots, collectively ChatGPT said. The figure stepping through the crowd wore a long coat dusted with snow, boots leaving deep marks behind him. Folks parted quickly, uneasy about the sudden tension running through the air. The widow's heart beat faster as she tried to see the man's face. Her hands still pressed lightly on the wounded warrior's coat. The warrior sensed something too. His breath tightened, and his fingers twitched, as if reaching for a weapon he no longer had strength to lift. The crowd's silence settled heavy. Like the cold itself was holding its breath, the man in the coat stopped a few feet from them, looking at the widow, then at the Comanche lying in the snow. His eyes were sharp, carrying a storm of their own. People whispered his name behind cupped hands. He had a reputation in town for being level-headed but guarded, someone who didn't let trouble pass without watching it closely. When he shifted his gaze to the warrior's wound, something like suspicion flared across his features. The widow felt her throat tighten. She didn't need this, not now. Not when she had just found the courage to step forward. She lowered her voice and told the warrior not to move, even though she wasn't sure he understood her words. He blinked slowly, exhaustion pulling him toward unconsciousness again. Behind her, the man in the coat asked what she thought she was doing. His voice carried across the snow. Some folks nodded in agreement, urging her to step back. She almost answered, "Shh," but her mind drifted again to the memory of that blizzard years ago. She had been traveling with her late husband then, riding through the whiteout to reach a small settlement on the far side of the ridge. Their horse had spooked, slipped on ice, and thrown her. Snow swallowed her faster than she could react. By the time she managed to lift her head, the wind was roaring so loud she couldn't hear her own cries. Her husband had disappeared from sight, carried by the storm. The ground had shifted. The cold had wrapped around her like a tightening grip. She remembered thinking that no one would find her. Not in that wild land. Not on a night when even the sky had turned white. But someone had found her. She remembered the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. A tall figure emerging through the storm. A coat lined with fur. A feathered piece of clothing. She remembered being lifted from the freezing ground, arms strong and steady, carrying her with a confidence that didn't match the chaos around them. She remembered the faint warmth of his voice, the steady rhythm of his steps. She had been too weak to speak, too cold to see his face clearly. But she had known even then that he saved her. Now, the details she had tucked away for years slowly came back. The carving he had carried back then matched the one resting in the snow beside her now. The same bird shape, the same smooth finish. It wasn't a coincidence. And if it was truly the same man, then the story of how he found her must have its own path. One she had never understood until now. She looked up at the man in the coat and said she needed to help the warrior. The answer didn't satisfy him. He asked why she would risk herself and her son, why she wanted to get involved in something dangerous. But she didn't have words strong enough to explain the feeling in her chest. The memory alone wasn't proof to anyone else, only to her. So she kept steady, telling him the warrior would die if they left him here. The crowd stirred, some uncomfortable with her calm tone. A few folks stepped back, unwilling to be caught up in whatever trouble was growing. The wind blew down the street, shaking signs on the storefronts, carrying loose snow across the ground. The warrior groaned softly, eyes slipping closed again. He was fading fast. She placed a hand on his shoulder to keep him from collapsing further into the cold. The man in the coat finally knelt beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. He wasn't cruel, just cautious. He leaned in to look at the wound. A deep gash cut across the warrior's side, likely from a blade rather than an animal. He asked how long she thought he had been traveling. She looked at the dried blood, the dust of snow frozen into the edges of the tear. She said maybe days, maybe longer. The warrior's horse, lying still beside them, had been pushed to its limit too. Its saddle blanket was heavy with frost. The animal had done everything it could to bring its rider to safety. The man in the coat let out a slow breath. There was trouble behind this. That much was certain. The widow reached for the warrior's hand and lifted it slightly, checking for frostbite. His fingers were trembling, skin cold, but still alive. When she tucked his hand against his chest to warm it, she noticed a faint tattoo near his wrist. The mark was shaped like a small trail symbol, the kind used by some Comanche families to show their path or lineage. She had never seen it before, but something about it felt old and important. It added more weight to her suspicion that he wasn't just any warrior, but someone with a story no one in this town understood yet. She wanted to ask him about it. But he drifted again between consciousness and darkness, his breath shallow around them. The folks in town kept murmuring, unsure whether to help or leave. They spoke of danger, of risk, of the unknown. Some said the warrior might be part of something larger. Others wondered if he came to warn them of trouble. The mystery tightened the air. The widow listened quietly. Every whispered worry made her more certain. She couldn't leave him here. She told the man in the coat to help her bring the warrior to safety. He hesitated, but she saw something change in his eyes when he noticed the carving in the snow. He picked it up, turning it in his hand, studying the worn edges. He didn't understand its meaning, but he could tell it wasn't something carried by someone careless. A few people asked if the warrior was dangerous. The widow shook her head softly, though she didn't know. She just knew what he had done for her long ago. She couldn't forget that. And she couldn't deny the quiet sense inside her that said he needed her now, just as she needed him that night in the storm, as the man in the coat helped shift the warrior into a position easier for lifting. The wind suddenly carried a sound from the far end of town. Hoofbeats, fast, urgent, a group approaching from the ridge road, their horses thundering over the frozen ground. The widow's heart sank. The man in the coat stood quickly, scanning the horizon. His jaw tightened as the riders came into view. 3 figures at first, then 4, moving as one. They weren't townsfolk. Their coats were dusted with travel. Their posture held the look of men who had been searching for something or someone. The townspeople started whispering again, fear slipping into their voices. The widow felt the warrior stir weakly, as if he recognized the sound too. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she saw worry flicker through them before exhaustion closed them again. Whatever had wounded him, whatever had driven him across miles of frozen land, it wasn't finished yet, and it was coming closer. The riders slowed as they neared the edge of town, scanning faces, shoulders tense, hands near their weapons. The snow reflected the low morning light, making their expressions hard to read. But the intent was clear. They were looking for someone, and the widow suddenly understood that the wounded warrior wasn't just running from the cold. He was running from them. She felt the ground beneath her shift, not physically, but in the way a person feels right before something big happens. The kind of shift that promised trouble, the kind that promised danger. The crowd stepped back, forming a loose wall behind her. The riders dismounted near the blacksmith shop, their boots crunching through the snow. One of them scanned the road and spotted the warrior on the ground. His hand dropped instantly to the handle of his revolver. The widow felt her breath catch. The mystery deepening, the danger pressing closer. The town held its breath again, wondering what would happen next, waiting for someone to make the first move, while the snow kept falling. Soft and silent around them, the widow felt the warrior's weight grow heavier against her lap as the riders approached. Each step they took sinking deep into the snow. The man in the coat moved closer to her, standing half between her and the strangers. Though he kept his hands loose at his sides, he wasn't trying to start trouble, but he wasn't going to run either. The tension clung to the cold air, and even the horses seemed to sense it, puffing steam through their nostrils as they stamped nervously. One of the riders pushed forward. His coat was worn, his face lined with windburn and strain. His eyes locked on the wounded Comanche with a mix of triumph and anger. He nodded toward the warrior and said they had been tracking him for 2 days. He didn't bother to hide the hardness in his voice. Folks near the mercantile backed away, some pulling their children behind them. The widow's heartbeat quickened, not just from fear, but from the sudden shape of truth forming inside. Her, whatever, had chased the warrior. Across the winter land had reached their doorstep now. The warrior stirred faintly when he heard the rider's voice. His breath hitched, and he tried to lift his head, but his strength failed. He sagged back into the widow's arms, and she felt his body tense from a memory she didn't yet know. The rider's gaze shifted to her. He demanded she move aside and hand the warrior over. His tone held no patience. He spoke as if the Comanche were already his to claim. The widow rose slowly, still bracing the warrior so he wouldn't fall back into the snow. She didn't know what right the man thought he had, but the way he spoke sent a chill deeper into her bones than the cold ever could. The man in the coat asked what the warrior had done. His voice stayed steady, though she could hear caution woven through it. The rider answered with a story that felt too clean, too simple. He claimed the warrior had raided a small homestead beyond the ridge, that he had stolen supplies and attacked their camp. But something in his tone didn't match the memory in the widow's mind. The warrior, she remembered, wasn't reckless. He wasn't cruel. He had saved her life when she had nothing to offer him. Another rider stepped forward to support the tale. Though he avoided the widow's eyes, the rest of the group stayed silent, shifting their weight uneasily, watching the townsfolk watch them. The tension built like a heavy rope pulled from both ends. The widow's breath fogged in front of her as she steadied her voice and asked how they knew it was this warrior who attacked them. The first rider's jaw tightened. He spoke quickly, too quickly, saying they had found tracks that they had seen feather traces near the camp, that the broken supplies matched a Comanche raid. But she noticed the small lies hidden between his words, tracks erased by storms, supplies disturbed, trail that any traveler might have taken. And the way he kept his hand near his revolver made it clear he wasn't telling the whole story. The man in the coat must have noticed it too, because he stepped forward and told the riders they weren't taking anyone without explaining more. His calm tone didn't hide the warning behind it. A few townsfolk nodded nervously. Some whispered about letting the law handle things. Others whispered about staying out of trouble. The widow stood still, her heart pushing her to protect the warrior. While her mind scrambled for answers she didn't have yet, the wounded Comanche opened his eyes slightly and whispered something too faint for her to understand. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from pain and exhaustion. She leaned closer, trying to catch the word. It sounded like the name of a place, maybe a warning, maybe a memory. The riders looked at each other. They had heard him too. That faint word shifted their posture. One man cursed under his breath, another tightened his glove. They seemed suddenly unsure whether to push forward or be cautious. The widow felt the change like a shift in the wind. Something about that place mattered. Something the riders didn't want known. The man in the coat asked again what really happened. This time the lead rider's answer wavered. He avoided the Comanche's face and instead spoke of a group of settlers who had passed through their camp earlier in the season. Supplies stolen. A frightened woman running toward their fire claiming someone had chased her. The rider insisted the tracks pointed toward the Comanche, but the widow noticed one thing he had not mentioned. One important detail missing from the story. He never said the woman had seen her attacker. The widow remembered her own blizzard night. She remembered how fear twisted the truth, how shadows of storms made a person misjudge shapes or footsteps. It was easy for someone to assume the danger came from the people they were told to fear, but she had learned the world wasn't that simple. She asked the rider if the woman ever actually saw the face of the attacker. The question hung in the air. The rider hesitated. His answer came too slow. He said the woman was too scared to remember clearly. The widow felt her heartbeat shift. She knew now the riders didn't have the truth. They had assumptions and fear, just like the townsfolk. And fear could lead to accusations sharper than any winter wind. She looked down at the carving beside her boot. The bird with lifted wings, a symbol that had saved her memory from fading entirely. She picked it up gently. When the Comanche saw it, he tried to speak again, but the effort was too much. He closed his eyes with a strained breath. Inside the carving, she knew there was a story. One she hadn't understood before. The man in the coat noticed her holding it and gave a small nod, as if reminding her she had a reason to stand her ground. The riders didn't like the hesitation in the crowd. They grew restless. Their horses stomped. One of the men muttered that they should take the warrior before things turned against them. The widow felt a pressure in her chest, something old, something deep. She couldn't explain it in words, but she knew she couldn't let them take him. Not when she owed him her life, not when she didn't trust their story, not when he was barely holding on. The man in the coat suggested bringing the warrior to the doctor. The riders objected instantly, saying it wasn't the town's concern that the warrior belonged to them now. The widow spoke up again, her voice firmer than before, telling them no one owned a dying man. The cold, the wound, and the truth pressing behind his silence weren't going to be handled out. Here in the snow, her words struck the air like a spark. The riders took a step closer. The man in the coat placed himself between them and the widow. The townsfolk shifted, some stepping back, others finding the courage to stay. The wind blew harder, lifting flakes of snow around their boots. The warrior groaned, his breath shallow. The widow felt his pulse weakening. She knew he didn't have much time left if he didn't get help. And all the while, her mind drifted back to that blizzard night. She saw flashes of the storm, the snow whipping against her face. The figure, carrying her with determination as though she mattered more than the danger around them. The carving, his tattoo, his strength even now. Everything matched the memory she had tucked away long ago. Had once saved her life without hesitation or fear of who she was. Now she stood in a town where everyone hesitated because of who he was. Farther down the road, a young boy came running out of one of the small houses near the mill. Her son. The moment he saw her kneeling beside the warrior, he froze, confusion and worry flashing across his small face, lifted a hand to signal him to stay back. But he hesitated, torn between fear and wanting to help. One of the riders looked at the boy, then at her, and something cold shifted behind his eyes. She felt it. The threat wasn't spoken, but it was there. A quiet warning that the riders weren't afraid to use fear to get what they wanted. The widow straightened, heart heavy with rising conflict. She could feel the riders closing in, the warrior losing strength, and the town growing anxious. Everything balanced on a thin edge, ready to tilt one way or the other. She held the carving tighter. Snow drifted around them in slow, silent waves. The wind grew colder. And just when it seemed like the riders might force the next move, the warrior's eyes suddenly opened wide. He whispered a single word in a strained breath, a warning, one that made the rider stiffen, the man in the coat flinch, and the widow feel the ground shift beneath her all over again. And before anyone could understand what he meant, the sound of another group of riders thundered from the ridge, rolling toward the town with urgency that promised the real trouble was only beginning. The sound of hooves thundered down from the ridge, echoing off the snow-covered rooftops and wooden storefronts. The widow felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The first group of riders stiffened, eyes darting toward the rising plume of snow in the distance. Even the townsfolk stopped breathing for a moment. Something was coming fast, and from the way the first group reacted, it wasn't something they had expected. The wounded Comanche whispered the warning again, his voice hoarse and weak. The widow leaned close, trying to understand him. His breath trembled as he forced out the name of a place she had never heard before. The man in the coat recognized it, though. She saw the way his expression changed. He asked the warrior if the incoming riders were connected to that place. The warrior's faint nod was all he could manage. Whatever group approached now was tied to the danger that had chased him across the winter land. The riders who had first tracked the warrior exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader swore under his breath and ordered his men to mount up. But it was too late. The incoming riders were already close enough for the town to see the shape of their coats and the tension in their posture. They were armed, traveling light, and moving with the speed of men chasing something important. The widow gently lowered the warrior onto the blanket. The man in the coat had spread beneath him. His breathing grew sharper as the second group neared. She knew he was afraid for more than himself. There was a story buried inside his silence, and every hoofbeat pounding from the ridge brought that story closer to the surface. The man in the coat told the widow to step back with her son, but she shook her head. She couldn't leave the warrior now, not when everything he had endured to reach this town was closing in on them from both sides. Her son stood near the mill, eyes wide, clutching the wooden post for balance. She motioned for him to stay put and keep low. Snow blew hard across the main road as the second group reached the edge of town. Their horses slowed as they approached the first group, tension thick as the two lines faced each other. Neither side moved, neither side spoke. The widow sensed a long history between them, something bitter and tangled. The air carried the sharp scent of conflict, the kind that didn't break easily. The leader of the second group stepped forward. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat lined with fur, his face shadowed by a brimmed hat. He scanned the road until his eyes landed on the wounded Comanche lying in the snow. Something in his gaze tightened. Recognition? Grief? Anger? She couldn't tell which. Emotion drove him most. He demanded to know what the other riders had done. His voice was quiet but razor sharp, like it had been sharpened by many winter nights spent fighting shadows and cold wind. The first group's leader insisted they were the ones chasing the Comanche for a crime committed near the ridge. But the second leader didn't believe him, stepped closer, calling out the holes in the story. The widow watched closely, noticing the shift in the riders' postures. They weren't just arguing over a wounded man, they were arguing over truth. A truth no one in the town understood yet. The second leader said the Comanche wasn't running from an attack he had made. He was running to warn settlers in the valley of an ambush planned by a group of outlaws who had been trailing families moving west for months. The warrior had risked crossing dangerous territory to help. The first group had mistaken him for the enemy and chased him down. The widow's breath caught. She looked at the Comanche, lying half-conscious on the blanket. Even now, bleeding and weak, he was still trying to protect others. The first group denied everything, but their faces said otherwise. They looked away, shifting uncomfortably, boots scraping the snow. Their story crumbled faster the more the second leader spoke. The man in the coat asked the second leader how he knew all this. The answer came like a cold wind. The Comanche was part of a group that had helped settlers survive harsh winters, shared water sources during droughts, and warned families of raids. People in distant valleys knew him as someone who crossed cultural lines to save lives. He had likely saved the widow because it was in his nature, not because he expected anything in return. The widow felt something stirred deep inside her chest. That memory from the blizzard pulled forward again, clearer now. She remembered the warmth in his arms. She remembered how he had shielded her from the wind, how he had carried her as if her life mattered, even though she had been a stranger to him. She had not known who he was then. She had not known the depth of his courage. But she knew now. The second leader stepped closer to the wounded warrior and knelt beside him. The warrior blinked weakly, recognizing the voice. He tried to speak, but the pain near his ribs forced him into silence. The widow steadied him gently, one hand on his shoulder, one on his arm. The second leader's gaze softened for a moment when he saw her helping. Then the first group made the mistake of reaching for their revolvers. The crowd gasped. The widow froze. The man in the coat stepped forward quickly, warning them to back down. But the riders from the ridge didn't flinch. They moved with purpose, hands hovering but not drawing, trusting their numbers and the truth behind them. A sharp wind gust blew between them, snow whipping across the space, making it harder to see. The widow shielded the warrior with her coat. He winced from the cold, but didn't move. The man in the coat raised both hands slightly, insisting the town wouldn't allow fighting in the road. The tension hung tight like a rope ready to snap. The first group hesitated. They had lost their confidence. They weren't prepared for the truth to surface. Their leader clenched his jaw, eyes darting from the second group to the wounded warrior. He knew the tide had turned, but the danger wasn't over, because just then the warrior whispered one more word, a warning that chilled the widow to her bones. More outlaws were coming. Not behind the first group. Not with the second. From somewhere else entirely? The second leader stiffened at the word. He whispered something to his men, and they instantly mounted. The first group panicked, unsure whether to flee or fight. Townsfolk scattered back toward the boardwalks, pulling children indoors, locking store doors, shouting for loved ones to get to safety. The widow didn't move. She stayed by the warrior, her heartbeat pounding. The man in the coat crouched beside her, placing himself between her and the open road. Her son huddled near the mill doorway, eyes wide with fear. The second leader told everyone that the group planning the ambush was close. The Comanche had been trying to reach the town before them. If the outlaws made it to the settlement first, winter would not be the only thing threatening their lives. The widow felt her fear tighten, but she also felt something else. A determination so deep it steadied her shaking hands. She looked at the warrior, seeing pain in his eyes, but also urgency. He had fought to reach them, even when he could barely stand. Even when others hunted him. Even when winter tried to swallow him. The town needed to prepare. The people needed warning. and she was the one close enough to understand the warrior's words. But before she could speak, a distant sound echoed across the valley. A shout, then another. Horses, many of them. Moving fast, the ridgeline trembled under their rush. The second leader shouted orders to his men. The man in the coat told the widow to get the warrior to shelter. She leaned down, whispering a promise to him that she would not leave him. He blinked slowly, trusting her. One of the riders from the second group dismounted and helped her lift the warrior carefully. His strength wasn't enough to stand, but together they got him onto a sled that a townsman pulled from behind the blacksmith shop. Snow creaked under their feet as they guided him toward the nearest storage barn. Where thick walls and stacked hay would offer some warmth, the first group debated fleeing, but the second leader blocked their path. Not with violence, but with the hard truth that they had brought this danger close by, chasing the wrong man. The widow placed her hand on the warrior's chest, feeling his heart beat faint but steady. She looked back toward the ridge, where shadows began to move, dark figures emerging, like wolves slipping through the trees. The final conflict was coming. The cold wind carried the sound of approaching danger, and as the widow knelt beside the warrior, the carving still clutched in her hand, she knew everything in her life had led to this moment. The storm that once nearly killed her, the stranger who had saved her, the years of quiet life afterward, the memory that returned only when she needed it most. What she did next would decide not only the warrior's fate, but the fate of the entire town, and the outlaws were almost upon them. Snow swirled low over the ground as the outlaws broke over the ridge, their horses kicking up white clouds behind them. Their shouts carried across the valley, echoing off the wooden fronts of the town buildings. The widow felt the sound strike her chest like a hard knock, but she didn't step back. She covered the wounded Comanche with her coat as the sled slid deeper into the storage barn. The wide doors were pulled shut, and the man in the coat braced a heavy beam across them to hold it steady. The barn smelled of hay, wood, and cold metal, but the thick walls trapped enough warmth to keep the warrior's breath from fading. Outside, riders from the second group fanned out across the main road, taking defensive positions. The townsfolk, though frightened, followed instructions and took cover where they could. A few men who had once been soldiers positioned themselves near the windows of the saloon and blacksmith shop. The widow's son rushed into the barn and wrapped his small arms around her waist. She held him close for a moment, then knelt beside the warrior again. He whispered something she couldn't understand. His hand trembled as he reached toward the carving she kept near his side. She pressed it gently into his palm. His eyes softened, filled with a quiet sadness and strength that reminded her of the night she first saw him through the blizzard. She told him to rest and promised the town would not fall. Outside, the first shots cracked through the cold. Horses shrieked. Wood splintered as bullets struck the side of the blacksmith shop. The outlaws thundered closer, trying to force their way into the heart of the town. But the second group met them head-on. The man in the coat led a few men toward the center of the road, shouting commands. Moving with the calm confidence of someone who had weathered storms before, the widow peeked through a small opening in the barn wall. She saw fear in the townsfolk, but she also saw determination. People weren't running. They were standing together. Even the ones who had doubted the wounded warrior were trying to help now. The Comanche shifted with a pained groan. She hurried back to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. His breathing was ragged, but he forced his eyes open. He whispered the widow's name, trying to thank her. She shook her head and told him he didn't owe her anything. He had once carried her through a storm without asking who she was. Now it was her turn to carry him through danger. The fighting outside thinned as the second group pushed the outlaws back. The leader of that group shouted for the townsfolk to hold their ground, then led a few men to circle around the alley toward the ridge. The outlaws realized too late that they were being surrounded. Their confidence shook. Horses bucked. Gunfire scattered wildly. The widow heard the shift in the battle. The rhythm of the fight went from fierce to desperate. Then a sudden quiet swept over everything. Not a deep silence, but the kind that comes after the worst has passed. She stood slowly, heart pounding. The man in the coat opened one barn door enough to stick his head out, then let out a long breath. He nodded. It was over. The outlaws who survived were being gathered and tied near the corral. Some dropped their weapons willingly. Others muttered under their breath, realizing the town wasn't as vulnerable as they thought. The second group's riders moved carefully, checking for any hidden danger. Townsfolk came out of hiding, shaken but safe, brushing snow off their coats and looking around at one another with relief. The widow knelt by the Comanche again, brushing a cold strand of hair from his forehead. She told him it was finished. He blinked slowly, a faint smile forming. He tried to speak, but his strength gave out, and his head rested back on the blanket. She lifted his hand in hers, whispering that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, rushing into the barn with his bag. He knelt by the warrior and began examining the wound. He said the warrior still had a chance, but he needed warmth, rest, and time. The widow offered her cabin. She insisted he stay with her and her son, where she could care for him. The doctor agreed it was best. The second leader entered the barn, his hat in his hand. He bowed his head respectfully toward the wounded Comanche. He explained that the warrior had been trying to stop the outlaws for days, warning every settlement he passed. He risked more than his own life. If he hadn't pushed himself so far, the outlaws would have reached the valley before anyone knew. The widow felt her throat tighten. She asked how long the warrior had been running. The leader said he had left his own camp days earlier, when the snowstorms were at their worst. He had crossed frozen rivers and climbed ridges alone. He had fought off the first group chasing him, thinking they were part of the danger. Every mile he traveled injured him more, but he didn't stop. Her heart ached at the thought. This man, who had once carried her through a storm without knowing her name, had now fought through another storm to save her town. The man in the coat entered, looking tired but relieved. He thanked the second leader for helping. They shook hands, a gesture of understanding. Between men who might never see each other again, but who would always remember that winter. Morning, the widow and her son led the doctor and the Comanche out of the barn and onto the sled. The sun had risen higher now, turning the snow into a bright blanket. People stepped aside as she passed, some offering quiet thanks. Others nodded gratefully, understanding now why she had stepped forward when everyone else hesitated. Her cabin sat near the river, where pine trees grew tall and still. Smoke drifted from the chimney as she stoked the stove and laid out blankets. The warrior was placed gently on her bed. Her son brought warm water and blankets, doing everything he could to help. The doctor stayed long enough to finish his work, then told her the warrior needed rest and food. He would survive, but the healing would take time. Days passed, and slowly the Comanche's strength returned. The widow kept a warm fire burning, made soups, and wrapped him in the thickest blankets she owned. Her son sat near him at times, admiring the carved bird and asking questions in a soft voice. The warrior listened, barely able to speak, but his eyes softened with gratitude when he finally stood on his own. Leaning against the cabin wall for balance, winter sunlight shone across his face. The widow stepped toward him, her heart full. She thanked him for what he had done years ago in the blizzard, and again for what he had done for the town. He reached gently for her hand. He didn't speak many words, but he didn't need to. His eyes held warmth that said he remembered her, remembered the storm, remembered the life he carried through the snow. The carving she kept safe on her shelf glowed faintly in the firelight, a reminder of the bond between them. When he was strong enough, the second leader returned with his men to escort him home. The widow walked with them to the edge of the ridge, her son holding her hand. The warrior stopped before leaving and gave her the carving again. But this time, instead of giving it as a token of journey, he pressed his fingers gently against her heart, telling her it belonged here. She felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from the warmth of something new, something she hadn't felt since she lost her husband. She told him her door would always be open. He nodded once, strong and quiet, and turned toward his people. The town rebuilt the damaged buildings, neighbors helping one another, grateful to still be standing strong through the winter. Folks often spoke about the morning they nearly lost everything, and about the widow who had stepped forward when fear gripped everyone else. They spoke of the Comanche warrior with respect, understanding now that he had never been the danger. He had been the one fighting to protect them. As winter thawed into early spring, the widow kept the carving on her windowsill, where sunlight reached it each morning. She hoped the warrior would visit again someday. Deep in her heart, she felt he would. Her son often asked if the man from the blizzard would return. She smiled and said, "The world had a way of bringing good people back when the time was right." And each time she stepped outside into the warm breeze, she felt the peace of knowing a story that had once begun in a storm had finally found its calm. The memory of that winter stayed alive in the valley as a reminder that kindness could cross old boundaries, courage could rise from unexpected places, and that even in the coldest season, hope could find its way back home.